It was one of those gray mornings in Seattle where the rain doesn't pour. It just hangs in the air like it's waiting for something to happen. I was sitting at a tiny corner table in a diner just off Pike Place, nursing black coffee that tasted more like burned ambition than anything else. The window beside me rattled softly with the wind, and I watched a man across the room hold court like he owned the place. Loud voice, expensive watch, that laugh you only hear when someone wants to make sure you know they're laughing. I'd seen that type before. Hell, I used to be that type. There's a strange kind of electricity that runs through people like that. They need a room, need attention. Feed off the glances and the subtle nods from strangers. It's not charisma they'd like you to think it is, but it's more like hunger dressed up in confidence. They live in high definition, but only if someone's watching. I remember a time when I'd step into a meeting and light it up just to feel seen. When I'd craft Instagram captions like war plans and edit my words in real conversations so they landed just right. But it never lasted. The buzz always faded, because ego is loud, but it's never full. It needs constant proof. What changed for me wasn't some big breakdown. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special. I was on a call with someone who'd just been promoted. They were boasting about their team, their metrics, their bonuses. I smiled, nodded, said nice. That's all. And for the first time I noticed something shift. Not in them, in me. I didn't care. And that moment, that little shrug of the soul, hit me harder than any compliment ever had. It was like pulling the plug on a neon sign that had been buzzing in my brain for years. The ego craves a stage, but indifference is the curtain drop. When someone throws out bait, whether it's flexing success, showing off intellect, or spinning humble brags, the most radical act isn't to challenge them. It's to stay still. Quiet, cool. Like they just told you the weather. People think strength is fire, but sometimes it's ice. The refusal to be moved. The decision to withhold your reaction, not because you're cold, but because you're rooted. And that unnerves people. It breaks their rhythm, especially those whose self-worth is built like a house of mirrors. That day, walking out of the diner, I felt taller without standing straighter. The kind of tall that doesn't need height, just distance. From the noise, from the pull, from the need to win anything. Because here's the truth. The loudest person in the room is often the emptiest. But the one who can sit in silence, who doesn't flinch when ignored or challenged, that's the person who owns the room without saying a word. I wasn't born that way. I learned it. And the lesson began with a cup of coffee, a rain-slick window, and the sweet, quiet power of not caring. There's a stretch of road between Austin and Marfa where the land flattens out like an open book. Nothing but sky and dust, the kind of quiet that makes you confront things you thought you buried. I was driving that road last spring, just me, a rental car, and the low hum of classic rock on the radio. I didn't have a destination, not really. I just needed out of the noise, out of my head, out of the cycle of proving something to people who weren't even watching. That drive reminded me of something I used to do when I felt small. Talk big. You ever catch yourself doing that? Throwing out achievements, dropping names, trying to wrap your insecurities in gold foil? It's a defense mechanism, and I see it so clearly in other people now. Not because I'm above it, but because I've lived it. There was a guy I worked with years ago, let's call him Ryan. Ryan was the walking embodiment of overcompensation. Every conversation was a flex. Every disagreement turned into a monologue. But one day I stopped challenging him. I asked him a question instead. He was mid-rant about how he never needed help, about how he always figured things out alone. And I remember calmly asking, "If that's true, why do you talk so much about it?" He paused, just for a second. But that pause was everything, because when the ego is confronted with its own contradictions, it stumbles. Not because it's weak, but because it's built on illusion, not introspection. Since then, I've learned the art of the surgical question. It's not about being clever or winning an argument. It's about inviting someone to confront the story they're selling. And sometimes, when they hear it out loud, even they don't buy it anymore. You don't have to shout. You don't have to insult. All you have to do is aim a mirror at the mask and say, "Tell me who that really is." Because if someone claims to be immune to criticism, ask why they're always defending themselves. If they say they're just being real, ask if honesty and cruelty are the same thing. If they insist they're confident, ask why validation still matters. These aren't attacks, they're invitations to clarity, to truth. And while not everyone accepts, the moment of hesitation speaks volumes. I've asked myself these questions too, and I hated the answers at first. But there's power in that discomfort. Growth lives there. As I pulled into a gas station off the highway, dust settling on the hood, I thought about how many masks we wear just to get through the day. But the mask always slips when the right question is asked. And when it does, you see people. Not their performances, not their personas. Just them. And sometimes that's all it takes. Not to destroy someone, but to wake them up. Title: Compliments That Echo. It was the middle of summer in Minneapolis, the kind of day where the heat sticks to your skin and the air hums with quiet tension. I was at a friend's rooftop gathering, craft beers and coolers, string lights overhead, people laughing too loudly about things that didn't matter. I stood by the grill, flipping burgers, when a guy I barely knew strolled up beside me and dropped a line that made me smile inside. "Man, it's crazy how chill you are. I'd be way more anxious in your shoes." He meant it as a compliment, but I knew what it really was: a cover. A sideways nod to something he was projecting onto me, maybe even envying. The thing is, I used to do the same, compliment someone on their bravery when I really meant, "How do you hide your fear so well?" That moment stuck with me, not because it stung, but because it reminded me of how masks work. We all wear them, some thicker than others. And ego? Ego is the mask made of mirrors. It doesn't just hide, it reflects. It wants the world to bounce its admiration right back into it. But here's the trick. When you reflect something a little too brightly, too deliberately, that mirror cracks. I've used compliments like that before, not to hurt, but to reveal. It's an art form. You don't accuse someone of insecurity. You praise the exact thing they're afraid of, but you do it just loud enough, just sweetly enough, that the compliment stops sounding like a gift and starts feeling like an echo in a funhouse. "You're so brave for wearing that," you might say. Or, "Wow, it's amazing how confident you seem, considering how many people would worry about saying something like that." On the surface, it's praise, but underneath, it's a flashlight pointed at the gap between who they want to be and who they are afraid they are. And the ego can't handle that light, because it thrives in the shadows of performance, in the silence of unchallenged identity. I'm not saying this to be cruel. In fact, I don't think cruelty has anything to do with it. It's about precision, about offering someone a mirror wrapped in velvet, soft touch, sharp truth. Back on that rooftop, the guy kept talking about his new job, his rising profile, his followers. I listened, nodded, then said, "You're incredible at making people feel like you're confident. I wish I had that skill." He laughed, then he blinked. Just once. A pause. Small but real. That's all it takes. Because when you over-compliment the performance, you spotlight the script. And the people most dependent on that script, the ones who need their ego fed to stand tall, begin to wobble. Not because they're bad, but because they forgot how to stand without the applause. Since then, I've learned to listen for the cracks, not to exploit them, but to understand them. Because when someone's ego is loudest, it's often their fear that's speaking. And sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is hand them back their own words, dressed as admiration. Egos aren't destroyed with insults. They unravel when the story they've been selling starts to sound like a parody. And in those moments, real identity, the quiet kind, has a chance to breathe. Title: The Weight of Not Reacting. There's something strange about walking alone through Boston at night. The way the cobblestone streets catch the light, how your footsteps echo back just a little too loud. It makes you hyper-aware of yourself. One night, I found myself wandering Beacon Hill, jacket collar up, headphones in, no destination. Just me and the low hum of the city, which, despite its size, felt oddly intimate. I'd just come from a dinner where I was tested in ways I didn't expect, not by questions or arguments, but by someone who knew exactly how to push my buttons. A former colleague who had made it a game to poke at my every decision, every silence, every perceived failure. He'd say things like, "You're really leaning into the whole chill vibe, huh? Interesting strategy." Or, "You still doing that creative stuff, or did you finally get serious?" A year ago, I would have taken the bait. I would have defended my choices, explained my process, maybe even snap it back with something clever. But that night, I didn't. I just looked at him, nodded, and said, "Yeah, just that," and kept eating. There's a power in stillness that nobody talks about. It's not flashy. It doesn't win applause. But it shifts the atmosphere. People expect a reaction. They need it to feel justified, to know they've touched something. When you give them nothing, not passive aggression, not coldness, just calm, it forces them to sit with their own discomfort. And most can't. I've come to learn that egos are like fire alarms. They're loud, constant, and only go off when something feels threatened. But if you stop rushing to silence them, if you let them blare into an empty room, they burn themselves out. Because ego feeds on control, on pulling you into its storm. When you opt out of the storm, you start to see things clearly. Walking through the quiet streets that night, I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded, not better than him, not smarter, just still. And in that stillness, I realized something that changed everything for me. You don't have to prove your piece to anyone. You don't have to dress it up in achievement or defend it with logic. It just is. And the moment you let it be, you stop playing the game entirely. Most people live in reaction mode. Someone cuts them off in traffic. They swear. Someone questions their choices. They explain. Someone ignores them. They spiral. But when you stop reacting, when you replace reflex with awareness, you become unshakable. That doesn't mean you're cold. It means you're sovereign. Your energy doesn't leak every time someone challenges your worth. Your day isn't hijacked by someone else's insecurity. I used to think power meant being the loudest, the sharpest, the most dominant voice in the room. Now I know it's something quieter, more permanent. It's the kind of power that lives in silence, breathes in pauses, and smiles in the face of provocation. It's not about being untouchable. It's about being so deeply rooted that no one can pull you out of yourself. So I kept walking, past the lit windows and brick walls, past the noise of imagined battles. And with every step, I felt lighter. Because the heaviest thing we carry is the need to be seen a certain way. And letting that go, that's real freedom. Title: When Attention Becomes a Cage. There's a ritual I have when I visit my parents in Vermont. I wake up early, before the sun rises, make a pot of coffee, and sit on the back porch wrapped in a blanket. The air is always a little colder than I expect, even in fall. And the only sound is wind slipping through the trees. No phones, no notifications, just breath and silence. During one of those mornings, I started thinking about how much of my identity used to be shaped by attention. Not just the obvious kind, likes, comments, the buzz of acknowledgement, but subtle moments too. Glances across a room, compliments tossed in passing. Even the absence of those things used to feel like an insult, like I was disappearing. You don't realize how much of yourself is tied to external validation until someone withholds it. And suddenly, you feel smaller, less important. You start performing again, chasing the reflection you want to see in their eyes. But here's what I've learned sitting in that quiet. If someone can manipulate your sense of worth simply by ignoring you, you're not in control. They are. That's not strength. That's bondage. And it's easy to confuse ego with identity. But ego needs feedback to breathe. Real identity doesn't. I remember a moment in college when I posted a photo I was proud of, spent way too long editing it, finding the right caption. And when it got fewer likes than expected, I deleted it. Not because it was bad, but because it didn't perform. Looking back, it wasn't the photo I deleted. It was a part of myself I didn't think was worthy without applause. That realization still stings. Ego convinces you that the world's reaction defines your value. It tricks you into measuring yourself in comments and comparisons, in how often you're noticed. But peace? Peace comes when you stop needing an audience to exist. The people who are hardest to manipulate aren't cold or detached. They're just whole. They've stopped outsourcing their worth to others. They don't rely on applause to keep going, and that makes them incredibly difficult to control. I'm not fully there yet, but I've started cutting the strings. Every time I post something without checking back obsessively, I'm cutting a string. Every time I say no without explaining myself, another string. Every time I sit in silence while someone tries to provoke me and I don't flinch, that's freedom. Because freedom isn't about having nothing to prove, it's about not needing to prove it. On that porch in Vermont, watching the sky slowly shift from black to gray to gold, I realized something simple but profound. The ego is addicted to being seen. But the soul just wants to be. So I let myself be. No angles, no captions, no mirrors. Just coffee, breath, and the kind of silence that feels like truth. Title: The One Who Doesn't Flinch. There's an Amtrak line that cuts through the Northeast Corridor, Boston to D.C., and somewhere along that ride, I always find myself lost in thought, watching towns flash past the window like old memories. On one particular ride, I was seated across from a man who radiated that quiet authority. He didn't look special, corduroy jacket, worn notebook in hand, but something about him felt immovable. Not cold, not arrogant, just present. We didn't talk, but I watched how people reacted to him. The attendant smiled longer. The kid in the seat beside him sat a little straighter. It wasn't fear, it was respect. The kind you can't manufacture. The kind that comes from stillness. That's when it hit me. Real power isn't loud. It doesn't need to assert itself. It doesn't push. It doesn't perform. It just exists, and in doing so, reshapes the energy in the room. I used to think dominance meant control, over others, over perception, over outcomes. But now I see it something quieter. It's the art of not needing to prove anything at all. And ironically, that's what makes you untouchable. The most dangerous person in the room isn't the one barking orders or boasting credentials. It's the one who listens more than they speak, who absorbs before reacting, who sees everything and still chooses silence. Because silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It's clarity. It's restraint. And in a world addicted to noise, it's rebellion. I've learned that egos thrive on chaos. They need reactions, conflict, attention. When you remove those ingredients, the ego has nothing to grip onto. It spirals. And people wrapped tightly in their egos, well, they unravel when they're no longer being fed. The point was never to destroy someone else's ego to feel powerful. That's just another kind of weakness, dressed up in cruelty. The point is to become the kind of person who doesn't need ego at all. The kind who no longer plays the game. I've met people like that. Not many, but enough to know they exist. They're the ones who don't flinch when insulted, who stay kind without being soft, who carry confidence like a quiet pulse, not a billboard. They're not trying to be seen, they're trying to see. And once you experience that kind of self-possession, you stop chasing external validation. You stop bending to the opinions of people who don't even know you. You become still. And from that stillness, everything changes. So now, when I walk into a room, I don't scan for approval. I don't perform. I root myself. In presence, in truth, in a calm so deep It unsettles those who haven't found their own. Because the truth is, once you realize you don't need to be impressive to be powerful, you stop exhausting yourself with performance. You let the mask fall. And underneath you find something rare, a version of yourself that doesn't need applause, doesn't fear silence, and doesn't flinch. That's the version I choose to be. Every single day.